that lied to you. Maybe it is your kids who are driving you to the point of insanity at this moment. Kids or for teenagers, maybe it's your parents. You're just like, they keep getting in the way of everything they actually want to have happen in my life. Maybe it's a rude neighbor or friend, but there's somebody has either done something to you or they've taken something from you, and you think, man, the best thing for you is if the same exact thing would happen to them. Is there anyone in your life to who you just really want to get even? Well, if you've ever felt that way, okay, if you've ever had those feelings, I'm assuming it is all of us, okay? I got a question I want us to think about this morning, okay? Does getting even ever actually help anything to get better? Okay, does getting even ever actually help anything to get better? And is there something out there that's even better than even? Okay, we're going to answer that question this morning. If you have your Bibles, open them up to Genesis chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45. If you don't, we'll have the verses on the screen here to my left and to my right. But if you're just joining us this morning, we're in the middle of a series that we've titled In Your Dreams. Okay, In Your Dreams, where we are looking closely at the life of a young man in the Old Testament named Joseph. And as we've been looking at Joseph's life, we've been seeing how he gives us and how he prepares us for his purposes in our life, how God reveals and how God fulfills our dreams. And if you're a little bit unfamiliar with Joseph, I'll try to catch you up what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. Joseph, as a 17-year-old kid, okay, he was sold into slavery by his brothers into the land of Egypt. And over the next 20 plus years, he had a pretty up and down life. Okay, he was sold into slavery. Shortly after that, he was falsely accused of rape. He was thrown into prison for a crime that he didn't commit, and he was left in prison and just forgotten there. But the whole time, he had been working behind the scenes of Joseph's life to where eventually he brings Joseph up to where he is second in command of the entire nation of Egypt, the entire country of Egypt. So that's what kind of where we find Joseph here at this point. He is second in command of the entire country of Egypt. In Egypt, they are in the middle of a famine, okay, a famine that Joseph predicted would happen. Okay, and as Joseph as he is kind of helping the country of Egypt and all the surrounding nations deal with this famine, guess who shows up on his doorstep? His brothers. His brothers who sold him into slavery 20 plus years earlier. Here, Joseph, he comes face to face with his brothers who wronged him in this ideal, perfect situation, opportunity to get even. But as we're going to see in this situation, God had something even better for Joseph than getting even with his brothers. Okay, and it's the same thing that's available for us in those same type of situations as well. What is even better than getting even? Let's see what Joseph can teach us. After having put his brothers through a series of tests to see if they've truly changed, okay, Joseph, he's actually been interacting with his brothers for about 2 years at this point, giving them a bunch of different tests. Joseph, he prepares himself to deal with his brothers. Okay, he comes face to face. He's been putting his brothers through these tests for about 2 years. They don't know who he is. Okay, they don't know that this was their brother. And Joseph says, hey, it's time for me to reveal myself to them. So let's see what happens. It says, then Joseph could no longer control himself. He's standing there before his brothers. Could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. So when Joseph, the time comes for him to make himself known to his brothers, he is so overcome with emotion that he can't even control himself. I mean, and think about what we said, everything that's happened. He's been thrown in a pit and left to die. Okay, he's been sold into slavery. He's been falsely accused of rape. He's been thrown into prison and just forgotten. But it's interesting as you read Joseph's story, not once does the narrator ever just talk about any type of emotion that Joseph felt. As he goes through all of those situations, it never mentions that he was fearful. It never mentions that he was bitter or angry. It never mentions any emotion that he feels. And I'm sure that he felt them, but the author, he just didn't feel a need to write about it. But here, when Joseph comes face to face with his brothers, 8 different times. 8 different times it tells us actually that Joseph was so overcome with emotion that he wept. That he wept. And we're not talking like the pretty Hallmark cry, okay? This is like, like snotty, like can't catch your breath, just tears. He was overcome with emotion. He was hurt. And if any one of us here, if we've ever been hurt by another person, we understand why. We understand why he felt that way. It hurts, okay? It hurts to carry hurt. At this point in Joseph's life, he's probably 40 years old. So he has been living with what his brothers had done to him for the past 23 years. Okay, for the past 23 years, he's just been holding on to all of these things that he's experienced. And it's painful. It's painful. It hurts to carry hurt. I was actually reminded of a situation that happened in my home a couple weeks ago. We were sitting around our kitchen table as a family. We were playing a board game, and in the midst of the board game, I said something that really ticked my daughter Conley off. Really ticked her off. I was winning, so I was probably just talking trash, which is just kind of what I do when I'm winning board games. But she's upset. Okay, and I try to apologize to her and tell her I'm sorry, but she doesn't want anything to do with it. Okay, she is mad at Dad. Okay, at this moment, she is ticked. And so much so that after we finish the game, Conley, she just gets up. She leaves. She goes upstairs. She goes, shuts herself in her room, and she wants to be alone. Now, one thing I've learned living with the women in my house, for as long as I have, been married 17 years. My daughter's 9. Whenever I do something to kind of offend them, it's just best to kind of give them a little bit of space before I come in and try to fix it. And so I just go in and I sit in our living room and I just start working on some different stuff. Well, about 30 minutes later, Conley, she comes out of her room. She comes downstairs. She sits down next to me, and she just starts to stare at me. Just kind of gives me this look. I'm like, okay, well, I stop what I'm doing. I look at her. I was like, hey, Conley, do you want to talk about something? And she sits there, and we're looking eye to eye, and these tears start to form in her eyes, and they start to come down her cheek. And she says a really profound thing. She says, Daddy, I don't want to be mad at you anymore. She goes, it makes me too sad to be mad. Isn't that interesting? I mean, that whole situation, she didn't do anything wrong. I did. Okay, I was the offender. I was the one who made the rude comment. I am the one who sinned against her. She didn't do anything wrong, but yet she was holding on to a lot of the hurt and the pain that resulted from our relationship because it hurts. It hurts to hold on to hurt from other people. And that's what Joseph is feeling in this moment. For 23 years, he's been holding on to what his brothers did to him. Well, so what does he do with it? What do we do with this hurt that we feel? Let's keep reading. We're going to see something that Joseph realized that helped him to deal with his hurt. Pay attention right here, because if we're ever going to try to learn how to deal with the hurt that we experience from other people, the hurt in our lives, this is a truth that we're going to have to come to realize as well. So Genesis 45, verse 3, it says, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt, and this is crazy. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. I'm like, for real? I mean, that's exactly what I would want them to feel. I mean, even at a little bit, I want them to feel a little bit of anxiety over the fact that they sold me into slavery. But he says, no, don't be distressed about what you did. How is Joseph able to say that? Do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there had been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So that it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. 3 different times in that conversation, Joseph tells his brothers that it was God who sent him. He says 3 different times. Now, whenever you see something repeated in the Bible, it's meant to grab our attention. Okay, it's meant to say, hey, this is something that we really need to focus on. And 3 different times, Joseph tells his brothers, hey, even though you sold me into slavery, God sent me to Egypt. God sent me to Egypt. He recognized God's control over the situations in his life. Now listen, that doesn't mean that, God is the one who caused his brothers to sell him into slavery. He's not responsible for the evil that they've done. But what that does mean is, even though he was able to use even the evil actions of his brothers to ultimately accomplish God's good purpose for his life. Joseph looked at his brothers and said, hey, you intended evil for me. God intended good, and God won. God won. Even your evil actions against me ultimately cannot thwart or stop God's good purposes for my life. The person who trusts God, no one can ever take them out of God's will. These moments where people hurt us, okay, these moments in our life where we face painful situations, we have two choices, especially when we come face to face with them. Okay, we can either look back at the evil that they've done to us, or we can look up and we can trust God's ultimate control in our lives. And in that moment, the thing that allowed him to deal with his hurt is, in that moment, Joseph, he looked up. He looked up. He says, God, I know that God was in control of this situation. We'll see what Joseph's confidence in God's control of his life allowed him to do. Verse 9 says, now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. He says, come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and all you have, I will provide for you there. Because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. Joseph, he tells his brothers, hey, come to Egypt. He says, I am going to protect you. I am going to provide for you. Okay, Joseph, he takes this moment, he steps back because he recognized God's control in the situations in his life. He was able to extend forgiveness to his brothers. Hey, now a little bit of clarification about forgiveness. What does it mean to forgive? What is forgiveness? Okay, forgiveness, we've all heard that phrase before, forgive and forget. Forgive and forget. Well, that is clearly that's not what's happening here. Okay, Joseph, he clearly has not forgotten what his brothers did to them. He even told them, he reminded them of that. He says, hey, I'm your brother Joseph, who you sold into slavery. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Okay, forgiveness, it's not spiritual amnesia. Okay, forgiveness, it's not just, hey, you don't have to deal with any consequences for some of the choices that you make. But forgiveness, here's kind of a working definition of forgiveness. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness is giving up my right to get even. Okay, forgiveness, it's not forgetting what they've done. It's not saying you'll never have any consequences, but forgiveness is giving up my personal right to get even with you. That's what Joseph does here. He's second in command of Egypt. Okay, his brothers who sold him into slavery are there. At this moment, he has every opportunity to bring the hammer down. But he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it. He lets go of that right in that moment to get even with the people who hurt him. That's forgiveness. You know, my grandfather on my mom's side, so my mom's dad, he was without a doubt the meanest person, and probably he's the worst person I've ever met. My grandfather on my mom's side. In fact, at his funeral, I remember we were there, and so the first words out of the pastor's mouth at his funeral were, Bob Cockey was not a good man. The first words out of his mouth at his funeral. That's nothing we want us to have said at our funeral. But he's sitting there. They're in a small town. He couldn't have said anything different. Everybody knew who my grandfather was. If he would have said anything different, they would have known that he was lying. It was obvious. Okay, it was obvious to everybody who knew him that he was not a good man. But it was even more obvious to the people in his family, the people that lived with him. My grandfather, he was verbally, he was emotionally, and he was physically abusive to all of the people in his family. That's the environment that my mom grew up in. And so the moment that she graduated high school, the first chance that she got out of there as fast as she could. And she left and she got away as fast as she possibly could. And if any of you have been in abusive situations before, you know it takes a lot of time. Okay, a lot of time and a lot of work to find any kind of healing to some very real trauma that you've kind of felt in your life. And my mom did that over several years. She started to work through the things that she had experienced. And at some point along the way, as she's kind of dealing with all of that, she came to the realization that, hey, as a follower of Jesus, I'm going to have to find some way to forgive my dad. Now, not to forget what he's done, not to excuse what he's done to me, but I'm going to have to find some way just to release this right that I have for revenge, to release this right that I have to get even with him. And so she worked through that. She kind of came to that point, and I got to see, it was crazy, about the last couple years of my grandfather's life, when my grandfather and my grandmother got to the point to where they really couldn't handle the day-to-day affairs of their life. Okay, they couldn't really handle the day-to-day affairs of their life. They needed some help. And now, in that moment where they couldn't really handle anything for themselves, my mom, I got to watch her step in and take care of my grandparents. Now, they didn't ask for it. He definitely didn't deserve it. But I got to watch my mom step in and care for them in those last few years of their lives. When the opportunity came to her to where she could say, hey, everything that you did to me, I'm going to make you pay right now. When the opportunity came for her to stick it to him, she didn't do it. She didn't do it. She released her right to get even. And that's forgiveness. That's forgiveness. It's releasing our right to get even. That's what happened with her. That's what happened with Joseph in this moment with these people who had wronged him. When he had the chance to get even, he didn't take it. He didn't take it. Let's keep reading and we'll see something pretty incredible that results from the forgiveness that Joseph extends to his brothers. Verse 14, it says, then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And this is interesting. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. Why does he mention that? Well, at the beginning of the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, it's talking about their relationship with his brothers. And it says that his brothers couldn't even speak a kind word to him. His brothers couldn't even speak a kind word to him. They had no communication at all. But here, because Joseph, he at this point, he has recognized God's control. Okay, his sovereignty, his providence, his control over the situation of his life. Not only is he able to offer his brothers forgiveness, but God also provided them the opportunity for reconciliation. God was even able to put the broken pieces of that relationship back together again, which ultimately is so much better than getting even. And that's the lesson that we learn from Joseph's story, kind of this part of this story. God allows us. It's one of the great things that God does. God allows us to get even better than even. God allows us to get even better than even. Listen, it hurts. It hurts to carry hurt, but forgiveness can release. It can bring some release in some of that pain that we experience in life. When those moments come to where we're face to face with people who have hurt us, people who have wronged us, we can either look back at what they've done, or we can look up and trust that God's control is over that situation, and we can let go of our right to get even. To get even. God, that's one of the amazing things that he does. He allows us to get even better than even with the people that have hurt us in our lives. Okay, so how do we do that? What does that look like in your specific situation? What kind of steps, what can we do to experience something even better than even in some of the relationships with the people who have hurt us in our life? Hey, the first thing right here, the first step you have to take, kind of the things that we learned here, is the first thing we have to do is you have to receive what you need to give. Okay, if we want to get even better than even in the relationships of our life, you have to receive what you need to give. Listen, I don't understand. I don't believe you can truly forgive another person if you have not first received some type of forgiveness yourselves. Okay, if we're going to give forgiveness to other people, the first thing that we have to do is we have to receive the forgiveness that our Holy Father offers us from sinning against him. Okay, and that's where Jesus fits into this whole story. Okay, Jesus, he came in, we've sinned against God, but Jesus came and he canceled the debt of the sin that we have against God. He died on the cross for our sins. He came back to life as a payment for our sins so that we could receive forgiveness from God. And so if you're here today and if you have not accepted, God's forgiveness, Jesus' forgiveness in your life, that's the first step that you have to take. You can't give something that you haven't already received for yourself. Okay, so we have to receive what you need to give. And second, you need to choose to forgive even if you don't forget. Okay, choose to forgive even if you don't forget. Okay, and that's kind of what we see in Joseph's story. Again, forgiveness, it's not spiritual amnesia. Okay, it's not forgetting what somebody has done to us. It's not saying that it never happened. It's not justifying what they did, and it's not saying they shouldn't face consequences for what I did. Even in the situation with my grandfather, I never remember being alone with my grandfather. Okay, that was not going to happen. He had lost that right. Okay, that was something that was never going to happen. There were consequences to what he did, but that's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is choosing, hey, I don't need to pay them back. I personally don't need to pay them back. It's personally giving up our right for revenge. So is there someone in your life with whom you need to kind of give up this right or this debt, this thing that you feel owed to get even? Who do you need to release of that debt? Choose to forgive even if you don't forget. See, God allows us to get even better than even. Hey, last story will be done. There's an ancient Japanese art form, and I'm going to butcher it, okay? It's called kintsugi. Ancient Japanese art form called kintsugi. And so there's a lot of different stories for how this art form came to be, to kind of be known. But one of the stories of how this happened is there was an ancient Japanese emperor who he had this favorite bowl. Okay, he had a bowl that he loved to eat at. Basically every meal he would eat out of this bowl. He loved this bowl. Well, one day, either through the careless actions of himself or through a mistake that somebody else made, this bowl is dropped and it breaks. Okay, this bowl is just shattered into a million pieces. Well, this emperor, he loved this bowl. And so instead of just getting another bowl, he brought in all the artists and all the potters, from their emperor, and he said, hey, can you guys put this bowl back together? Well, all of them, they just looked at, it's just some of them were small pieces, some of them were dust, and all of them walked away and said, no, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this because I'm not going to be able to make it like it was. Well, there was one artist who said, hey, I'll take it. I'll at least give it a try. So he took all the pieces of this emperor's favorite bowl. He brought it to his house and home, and he started working on it, and he started to put the different pieces back together. And what he did to fix this bowl to where there were still cracks, he would fill them with gold. So he took this bowl and he started to put it back together and filled in the cracks with gold. And ultimately he takes this bowl back to the emperor and he hands it to him and says, this is what I've been able to do with your bowl. And the emperor tells him, this is even better. It's different, but it's even better than it was before. It's even better than it was before. And listen, all of us here this morning, there's two things that we all have in common. And so it's crazy that's thinking through this bowl. There's two things that all of us have in common. Every one of us here, we have either been hurt by someone else or we've hurt other people. Okay, we're all kind of there. We've been hurt by someone else or we've hurt other people. We've all done that in our life. And some of us have made huge mistakes with your marriage. Some of you've blown it with your parents. You've blown it with your kids. You've blown it with a neighbor. You've blown it with your friends. And you're just kind of wondering, is it ever going to be like it was? Is it ever going to be the same? Is it ever going to be like it was? And listen, it may not be. It may not be. It may not ever be the same. But God, when he takes these pieces and puts them back together, sometimes it looks even better than it did before. When we do that work and when forgiveness steps in, sometimes our relationships, they can get even better